Hello and welcome to the next installment about the Truth Factory. I will assume that you already watched the first video on Team Skeptic's channel, and you will have realized that the Truth Factory does fabricate a lot, but not truth. In this video, we will be looking at the ever nefarious climate agenda, which is somehow informed by identity politics.
Welcome back to the Truth Factory. The whole climate debate can basically be summed up with the question, is the burning of fossil fuels going to cause a global catastrophe if we don't act now?
Yes, it probably will.
Now, on the most extreme side of the debate, the science is settled,
No serious scientist will say that.
and humanity only has a few years left to do whatever the UN says.
No, the UN is advised to listen to scientists and develop legislation. Individual countries can voluntarily sign up to different agreements, such as the Paris Accord. No one is forcing countries to do this.
Or the Earth will be destroyed in a way that mirrors the trailer from the day after tomorrow due to the emissions created by evil humans, particularly evil Western humans who should apparently eat bugs and stop reproducing.
Eat bugs? What, like this cricket? Do you have a problem with that? Last time I checked, cats love to eat spiders. That aside, yeah, eat bugs. It's actually quite tasty. Now, the benefits of eating insects actually go beyond just the environmental bonus that it requires orders of magnitude less water, carbon emissions, feed, and space. Now, with scale, insects will provide a cheap, high protein and high fiber food source. In the West, insects are mainly just novelty snacks for hipsters at this point, but soon enough, they could very well become part of our diet. However, I am quite concerned that this supposed super green food doesn't come in recyclable packaging, or maybe they just forgot to label it.
Meanwhile, it's fine to play Helen Keller about China and India because of identity politics.
You know, I always find it rather funny how people so opposed to identity politics tend to be the ones making it part of the discussion.
On the other side, you have skeptics like myself that dare to question the Church of Anthropogenic Climatology.
Oh no, crazy cat lady. You are not a skeptic. At least you're not demonstrating healthy skepticism. Because questioning the mainstream narrative is not the actual problem. It's denying the empirical evidence that's laid out in front of you in order to maintain your pre-drawn conclusion. And in this instance, I believe your idea of skepticism is really more well defined by denialism, cynicism, and contrarianism. For example, you have no problem going against the mainstream narrative and denying the overwhelming evidence that supports it, while refuting it with evidence that you have obviously not held to those same skeptical standards. In other words, you blindly accept the evidence that supports your belief while blindly denying that which does not. And that's not what being a skeptic is all about.
Whether or not the sky is really about to fall on us. And I'm sure in a few years or hours, this sort of questioning will be categorized as hate speech. Because the mainstream narrative goes something like this. Don't question it, only listen to the scientists.
Well, scientists are typically the most informed individuals in their field of study. As a matter of fact, every time you present evidence to the contrary, you are simply producing the findings from a scientist with an opposing view. The reason why scientific evidence is accepted with more confidence is because of the scrutinous nature of the scientific method. And I don't think anyone is going to classify your videos as hate speech, as you aren't really being hateful or encouraging violence towards anyone. I think what you're trying to do here is play victim and gain sympathy in advance from your audience for when the big bad scientific consensus bullies your video and people like us prove you're wrong.
Okay. Oh no, not those scientists.
Reductio ad Hitlerium. Nice. And for those of you that don't speak Latin, it means reduction to Hitler, or Godwin's law, and is often referred to the point in an argument at which one side compares the other side to Nazis or Adolf Hitler. In this instance, Crazy Cat Lady is trying to invalidate anyone who speaks out against the climate change deniers by comparing them to Hitler's oppressive nature during the rise of Nazi Germany. It should also be noted that it's also the point in the argument where proper discourse begins to fall apart and is typically initiated by the person who's losing the debate.
How dare you!
Now, I won't deny that CO2 has risen over the past 150 years or that humans are largely responsible for that.
Good, because there is no denying either of those two empirically backed claims.
And I think it's reasonable to assume that increasing CO2 should have some effect on the climate, at least indirectly. My main issue with the climate debate is the political hijacking of it and the policies being made in the name of environmental action to the tune of trillions of dollars that really have nothing to do with the environment at all. We're also trying to solve an equation that could have dramatic economic impacts before we even understand all of the variables.
Speaking of monetary values and predictive models, why is it that recently we have seen a trend in insurance companies backing out of their oil investments and no longer covering companies who remain invested in oil or coal production? Quite simply, the monetary damage from natural disasters related to climate change has finally exceeded the profits made from insuring the companies who are indirectly responsible for anthropogenic climate change. The truth is in the numbers. 18 of the past 20 years are the hottest since the 1880s, with no sign of stopping in the near future, and in 2017 alone, 3 hurricanes, Irma, Maria, and Harvey, hit the Americas, causing $265 billion in damage. Most of this money comes from the pockets of the insurance companies, and it's simply not profitable for them to continue investing in fossil fuels.
After more than 3 decades, hundreds of millions of dollars, and countless hours invested, I can admit that prediction models have gotten more accurate, and they do a relatively good job at averaging global temperatures and ocean circulation. But there are still many chaotic fundamental processes that these models can't account for, as climate is the most complex coupled nonlinear chaotic system known to man. And CO2 is certainly not the only thing that has an effect on our climate. There's the sun, volcanoes, the tilt of the Earth's axis, water vapor, methane, clouds, ocean circulations, plate tectonics, albedo, atmospheric dust, atmospheric circulation, cosmic rays, particulates like carbon soot, forests and land use, and so much more. There has always also been an irreducible element of chaos, unknown variables, and feedbacks in Earth's climate system that no supercomputer can ever account for.
Oh, look at you trying to look all clever by putting pictures up which contain numbers and irrelevant equations along with big sounding words. Yes, the climate is a non-linear system. Yes, there are feedback loops. Yes, there are unknown variables, but the empirical evidence state that there is a big problem. Now, there could be a variable in a list of unknown things that will actually ensure that everything will be fine. But using that as an argument against taking action is the same as, say, playing Russian roulette with a semi-automatic, because there is the chance that the gun will jam.
And since computer models can't accurately account for most of these fundamental processes like clouds and terrestrial sync, they just basically guess, which they call parameterization. They use this $5 word because just calling it a guess would reveal that the emperor is wearing no clothes at all.
No, it is because calling it a guess would be wrong. Let's say that we have a model, albeit a flawed model, but the best one that's available. The model says that scenario 1 is the most likely, and there's an 80% chance that this is correct. Scenario 2 has a 10% chance of being correct. Scenario 3 also has a 10% chance of being correct. Now, based on that information, and let's remember that this is the best information that is available, are you going to prepare for scenario 1, 2, or 3?
For example, the only thing this climate graph is projecting is vomit.
Oh, how scientifically illiterate can you be? That clearly shows an upward trend.
Tropospheric models projected about twice as much warming as what actually happened, which wouldn't be so bad if energy policies weren't based on model predictions rather than real temperatures. Admittedly, most surface temperature model projections are pretty good. If you forgive the fact that many temperature stations that they get their data from have been found next to things like air-conditioned exhaust vents, in asphalt parking lots, and at the end of runways being warmed with jet engine heat, all of which falsely inflate the readings, showing more warming than what is actually happening. Artificial warming from these factors was proved in a recent study a few months ago. So what percentage of warming over the last 100 years is actually from CO2 versus the changes in the measurement environment? And although you'll hear the alarmist community continually repeat how great the models are, in a study testing their accuracy, climate models perform substantially worse than a random walk formulation, with the author of the study saying that this implies that the current climate models are ill-suited for regional decadal predictions, even though they are used as inputs to policymaking. Isn't it super reassuring that the models used to make life-altering global policies could be replaced with Homer Simpson's drinking bird and have the same or a better outcome?
Nice cherry pick. Now, did you read the paper? I'm guessing you didn't, as it is quite complicated, but there is one very important sentence in that paper. I quote, "But there is no comfort for those who reject the whole notion of global warming. The forecasts still remain inexorable upward, with forecasts that are comparable to those produced by the models used by the IPCC." You see, the paper actually tests forecasts in very specific conditions and limiting cases. At best, the author questions where the emphasis is placed in policy rather than the existence and risks of anthropogenic climate change. Also, may I add, the author is not a climate scientist.
Most models make the assumption that the Earth has a perfect natural balance. But this leads to every unknown or chaotic phenomenon being attributed to the burning of fossil fuels.
It is generally assumed that the climate doesn't change unless there is a reason for it changing. And when the climate does change, you want to look for an answer. And with the current climate changing, it seems that there is one glaringly obvious answer, and that is high CO2 concentrations.
It sees correlation and it makes the assumption of causation, in the same way that mankind used to blame all extreme weather and bad crops on witchcraft. In fact, the most extreme witch trials happened during the Little Ice Age, orchestrated by some of the most educated and respected members of society. Under their leadership, it's estimated that up to 80,000 people across Europe were executed for witchcraft and so-called weather cooking. And the skeptics who questioned this practice were ridiculed or accused of sorcery themselves, because of course, the science was settled.
But what you're failing to take into account is there's a big difference between science today and science way back then. One of these differences being the advent of the scientific method. And even though the scientific method was being developed during the time of some of the witch trials, it did take a bit of time to be developed. And it also took a bit of time for it to be adopted by the majority of people. And another big difference is today we have peer review. In fact, the peer review process wasn't introduced until 1731, which was after the witch trials had ended in England. And what I'd say would have to be the biggest difference is that today, science isn't just simply decided by what the Holy Scriptures say. It's decided by data.
There is a very good reason why the first rule of statistics is that correlation does not equal causation, because it's very easy to end up with false assumptions. For example, there is even a direct correlation between the amount the US spends on science with an increase in suicide by hanging, which is something that Jeffrey Epstein definitely did not do.
But the problem with that argument is that rule only applies if you don't know the mechanism. When it comes to climate change, we do. But for argument's sake, let's pretend like that doesn't matter. Let's just go off statistics alone. The next question that you'd ask yourself would be, well, what is the probability that this correlation is causation? Luckily, there was a paper published in 2014 which answers this exact question. Using statistical analysis, it found that it is highly likely that the global warm temperatures are directly attributable to greenhouse gases. But the really important part is the number they give to highly likely, and that is 99.999%, which is extremely likely.
There are billions of dollars in federal funding available for climate change research and technology, with funding increasing every year. Therefore, global warming needs to be a serious enough threat to justify continued large expenditures. No one hires a fireman if there are no fires, and you don't get million-dollar government grants to study non-problems.
Except the technologies developed to help fight climate change won't just be useful in fighting climate change. They can also have other uses. For example, renewable energy can help increase the supply of electricity, especially if something like coal becomes scarce.
And on the flip side, prior to 2008, a handful of skeptical groups were given a cumulative few $1 million from ExxonMobil and Koch Industries. Receiving funding either way does not necessarily invalidate scientific results, and I'd like to err on the side of positive thinking and believe that the vast majority of scientists are honest. But until we can fund science without the risk of artificially promoting bias, it's understandable to be skeptical of anyone whose paycheck directly depends on what version of the truth comes out of their mouth, especially when that's used to influence energy policies.
But one of the things that would have to be considered is if every single climate scientist were lying, then what is the chance that it would be leaked that there was a big conspiracy in the scientific community? Now, AB Science has made a video on this, and it appears that if there were a giant conspiracy involving all the climate scientists, then it is very likely that the whole conspiracy would have been blown by now.
This brings me to the infamous hockey stick graph created by Michael Mann, Bradley, and Hughes. This graph shows the global surface temperature remaining approximately constant for nearly 1,000 years, and then rising abruptly from 1900, showing that the warming in the 20th century is due almost entirely to the increase of atmospheric greenhouse gases, and that modern warming is unprecedented. This instantly became the go-to graph for the International Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. The obvious issue here is that it's wrong. Man's hockey stick literally flattened history by erasing the medieval warming period and the Little Ice Age. This is ironically a true example of man-made global warming. If your goal is to establish that today's warming is completely unprecedented in recorded history, all you have to do is eliminate any evidence of warming in the last 1,000 years for entirely natural reasons. In 2004, this graph finally received much-needed criticism for the artificial creation of the hockey stick shape due to incorrect statistical analysis. It turns out that the hockey stick shape could only be created after cherry-picking through hundreds of samples and only using those that gave them the picture that they wanted. For example, they derived all of the temperatures over the 15th century from looking at a single tree. To quote a tree reconstructor who worked with Michael Mann, "You have to pick cherries if you want to make a cherry pie."
So yes, there have been criticisms of the hockey stick graph, whether it be people criticizing the analysis methods used, or whether it be people like yourself accusing them of cherry picking. The issue though is that as time goes on, analysis methods improve. And as analysis methods improve, people decide to go, hey, what if we use the new analysis methods to see what results we get? And when using the new analysis methods, people find that, oh, we get a hockey stick shape. And also another thing to note is that as you go back before the 16th century, the graph that you're using shows that there is a lot more room for error.
If we compare the hockey stick graph to one created by Jungquist with data from 120 proxy records from all over the world,
now to me it seems like you are being intentionally dishonest here, because you said that the graph that you are showing contains data from all over the world. It doesn't. In fact, it appears that you've gone and cut something out of the top of the graph. Luckily for us, you've actually shown this graph in a previous video. See, it's for the Northern Hemisphere. And not just the Northern Hemisphere, but the extratropical Northern Hemisphere. Now, I don't like to accuse people of being dishonest, but when you omit that kind of information, it really brings into question your integrity.
we see a much different and likely more accurate version of natural climate variation, 3 to 4 times larger than in man's graph.
Now, unlike your previous mishap, this could be an honest mistake. But right here, you are comparing a 2,000 year time span to a 1,000 year time span. So let's take a look at what the actual comparison looks like. So here we are seeing results that in some areas are surprisingly similar to each other. In fact, when looking at the 15th century, the part where you accused Michael Mann of cherry picking the data, it lines up extremely well. Sure, It doesn't quite show the massive medieval warm period that you want it to. But there's a reason for that. To quote the paper that you got that graph from, we should, however, keep in mind that our reconstruction is scaled against extratropical northern hemisphere temperatures, whereas the Moberg et al. And Mann et al. Reconstructions are scaled against the northern hemisphere temperatures. So what they're saying there is that Mann's reconstructions are bound to have less variability because it covers the whole northern hemisphere, whereas their reconstructions only cover the extratropical northern hemisphere. Now, to be fair, they were referring to a 2008 reconstruction by Michael Mann, but the 2008 reconstruction isn't terribly different than the 1999 reconstruction.
But the IPCC already knew this, as the medieval warming period and the Little Ice Age can clearly be found here in the first IPCC assessment, published in 1991, that would later be replaced with the hockey stick graph. Because real data is irrelevant to an industry driven by making fake doomsday predictions.
You are kinda missing the point here. Even with all the corrections, the conclusion is still the same. Here, let me help you with that graph, as your black line misses a key detail. Yes, not only is it much hotter, the rate of change is also really scary. Yeah, and are you really that illiterate to not see that this graph still supports the same conclusion?
You don't ask, is the science right? You ask, should we have carbon credits?
Speaking of which, in 2009, emails were leaked from the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia.
Yay! We are getting to ClimateGate. Now, why am I not surprised? And leaked is a very nice way of saying illegal as fuck hacking perpetrated by the right-wing media. Anyway, let's see what nonsense you are going to repeat and then ignore that all of it has been debunked already.
From some of the leading names in global warming research, this was known as ClimateGate. One such correspondence is from Phil Jones, director of the CRU, who wrote to hockey stick Michael Mann, in an email labeled Highly Confidential. I can't see either of these papers being in the next IPCC report. Kevin and I will keep them out somehow, even if we have to redefine what the peer review literature is. Seemingly, the scientists did not want to consider studies that challenge the view that global warming is man-made.
The paper that sentence referred to was not rejected on the basis of providing a contrarian view. It was just shit.
Kevin Trenberth to Michael Mann. The fact is, we can't account for the lack of warming at the moment, and it's a travesty that we can't. Our observing system is inadequate. So rather than admit they're wrong, it's better to blame reality. If anything, these people are the real climate deniers.
It is funny that you are using this as an example to claim that there is a secret hidden agenda and that climate change scientists are deceptive. Actually, he is referring to an analysis that he performed earlier and already published a month before that email was sent. Hardly secretive.
As you can see, ClimateGate appeared to show a few influential IPCC scientists trying to manipulate data and also interfering with the peer review process to keep skeptical papers out of scientific journals. Follow-up investigations found the scientists to be innocent of any wrongdoing, but the same could be said about Hillary Clinton's emails, which literally talked about making sacrifices to Moloch.
Oh wow, you really don't understand humor, do you? Do you not see how that was a joke? As for the CRU scientists, they did not manipulate data. This is a line spun by a journalist called James Dellingpole, who reported on the story in his blog. Unfortunately, he doesn't really have the scientific literacy to be able to comment on the methods used. The most famous example of this is the nature trick, where Phil Jones says that he completed Mike's nature trick to hide the decline. This was jumped on as the trick somehow meaning falsification and a decline to mean decreasing temperatures. Now, Mike's nature trick is actually a statistical method which was published by Mike in Nature, and a decline actually refers to something called the divergence problem when using tree rings. The process is entirely valid, hence Mike published it in Nature. The claim that they interfered with the peer review process is also complete nonsense. Firstly, they refer to the IPCC report, which is not a peer-reviewed journal. Secondly, what you are probably referring to is the email in which one of the scientists asked for support in reviewing a paper. Now, this is a bit sketchy around confidentiality, but the individual in question recognized that he was extremely biased against the paper and he wanted a second opinion as he was afraid that he was being a dick.
So if nothing else, reading through the ClimateGate emails certainly paints a negative picture of a culture full of groupthink and self-righteous intolerance to criticism. In 2017, ClimateGate 2 Electric Boogaloo hit.
Ooh, Climate Change 2 Electric Boogaloo. Who doesn't love a sequel? On which note, to get the sequel to this video, pop over to Planarwalk's channel for the next installment. So thank you all for watching. Thank you Team Skeptic and Planarwalk. And we will now go over to New Zealand for the next installment. But first, I'm going to finish my crickets. Eat bugs? What? Like this cricket? You have a problem with that? Now, last time I checked, cats love to eat spiders. So, well, that aside, yeah, eat bugs. It's actually quite tasty. The benefits of eating insects actually goes beyond just the environmental bonus that it requires orders of magnitude less water, carbon emissions, feed, and space. With scale, insects will provide a cheap, high protein and high fiber food source. Unless you choke on it. Unless you choke on a wing. Fuck.